It's Ladies Talking Love, Season 3, Episode 3, Talking to Kids About Sex, Part 1. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex, as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. I have been excited about bringing you this series of episodes for months. And so I'm really glad that it's finally here. I remember talking to a friend about parent-child sex communication, and she just expressed to me that she had heard podcasts and heard of resources to help parents know how to talk with their kids about sex, but none of these resources were broken up into distinct age groups. And so she was like, I don't know exactly how to talk to my different aged kids. And so I realized it would be super helpful to have a series of episodes where we break up how to talk with your kids about healthy sexuality and their body parts that maybe we don't talk about as much. And all of this includes so much more than we might initially think of when we think about talking to our kids about sex. And these conversations can start right from birth, as Dr. Padilla-Walker is going to talk to us in this episode, where we'll cover talking to kids from birth to age 7. And these conversations can start simply by just helping our children learn the correct anatomical names of their genitals. And so I really hope that this series will be helpful in answering those types of questions that you've had. How do I talk to my kids about healthy sexuality, about sex as they're getting older, as they're asking questions? Or maybe they're not asking questions, but you want to start having these conversations to have a really open dialogue with your kids so that they know they can come to you with any question. Dr. Laura M. Padilla-Walker is a professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 2005. Her scholarship focuses primarily on how parents socialize adolescents' positive behaviors, with special emphasis on parent-child communication about healthy sexuality and pro-social media. Aside from over 100 journal publications, Dr. Padilla-Walker has co-authored a book for parents on how to teach their children healthy sexuality. She is currently serving as the Dean of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. She and her husband, Chris, are the parents of 3 children. Before jumping in, I just want to thank you again all so much for being here with me and learning with me. I hope that this episode is really helpful, and make sure and look for those next 2 episodes that will be coming out in the next several weeks, covering ages 9 to 12 and then teens. But without further ado, let's talk love. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Laura Padilla-Walker onto Ladies Talking Love today. Thanks for joining me, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
This has been a topic I've been wanting to do for a while, so I'm so grateful that Laura is willing to come on and share her expertise with us about child-parent communication around sexuality. And we're going to have 3 sections of this. So this is going to be the first episode, and we're going to cover birth to age 7. I've had parents talk to me that this is a tricky thing for them. They don't know how to talk with their kids about sex. And if they've heard things about it, it often doesn't split it up into these age groups. And so I'm really excited to kind of dig in. So we're going to start with birth to age 3. And a lot of people assume that we don't really need to start talking with our kids about sex when they're this young. But why is it important to kind of start these conversations from birth?
Well, I think at an early age, what's most important is giving children the right vocabulary for their bodies. I mean, you're really not going to be having detailed conversations about sex, obviously, with your 1-year-old, but using the right terms from an early age, it's really more for the parents even than for the child, but it helps you to practice using the appropriate terminology, call body parts what they are, so that children learn that there's nothing to be ashamed about when talking about a penis or a vagina. Those are just words that we use like elbow and shoulder and knee. Help them to learn about how wonderful their body is. We're just working on a paper right now looking at what we call body talk in children ages 2 to 4. And most research doesn't look this young, but we're trying to understand how parents talk to their children about the child's body from a really young age and how this relates to sexuality and body image. And it's interesting because parents, just like when kids are older, they're waiting until their kids are touching their own bodies or asking questions. And we really want to be proactive and be talking to children about their amazing bodies, talk about how great their eyes are and their nose and their ears. And we can do that with all different parts of their bodies and using the proper vocabulary. So just starting with simple things like that can really help to have them think positively about their bodies as they get older.
And I found that so helpful when I first started having kids. I was still really uncomfortable using penis, vulva, vagina, all these terms, and being able to start practicing from when they were so young helped me get to a more comfortable place as they got older as well, which was really helpful for me. And you talked about that we would say how amazing their eyes are. I think sometimes that can be really hard for parents to be like, well, what would I say that is amazing about a penis or a vulva? What are some things that we could talk to our kids about to show them how amazing these body parts are at this age?
So let me just comment first on what you said. I mean, sometimes I tell parents, if this is awkward for you, because not all of our parents did a great job teaching us about sexuality. So some of us are still pretty uncomfortable, and that's okay. But I'll say just practice saying the words. If you have to practice it alone in the shower or alone, whatever, just so that you can say the words and be comfortable with them. Practicing just with your child is great too, especially when children are touching their own bodies, which they will do. It's completely normal. You can say something like, oh, that's your penis. Isn't that wonderful? Look what happens when you touch it. Or it doesn't have to be a shame thing like, don't touch your body. That's oftentimes what parents will do. If you have a child who's consistently self-stimulating at a young age, the best thing is to just distract them. You don't even have to say anything about it. You can just give them a different toy or move on to something else. I don't know how much I would get into the function of their bodies at that point, but you could talk about things they understand, like going to the bathroom or other things that you do. And then as they get older, you can talk to them about, other things that happen with their bodies. With girls, you could talk about what's going to happen when they get older and they start to have their menstrual cycle and other things like that. There's developmental appropriateness to how you want to talk with your kids about the different parts of their bodies. But the biggest thing at this age is not to attach any shame to any part of their body. So if they're touching their vulva or if they're touching their penis, not saying, don't touch that. We don't touch ourselves. You might say in public, we don't touch our bodies in public because we're trying to be private or something very simple like that. But not attaching shame from a really early age is just a great practice for parents and really healthy for children.
Yeah. And I think as we just use those correct anatomical terms and even I love what you said of just things that they might even notice. I heard someone talk about like, oh, like, isn't that interesting how your penis gets hard or, and just to we don't have to go into detail, but just like, oh yeah, it's really cool.
You might say to your daughter, if she's touching her nipple, you might say, yeah, that's your nipple. And when you get older and you have babies, that's where you're going to feed them. And just like mom does, you could just make it really natural like that.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Just the things that they may notice. And I really like that a lot, especially with sexuality and starting to have these conversations around bodies, be normalized and see the beauty in our bodies at a young age when we're talking about body parts, saying the anatomical terms, helping them see the beauty and the amazingness of their bodies. I think a lot goes into also children starting to understand the power of their minds and their spirit and how everything works together. What are some things we can do to empower our children to value their body, mind, and spirit at this age from birth to 3?
I think the principles are the same that, we might be more willing to talk to our children about their amazing brain or the amazing way that they think about things. They're also very emotional at this age. They're trying to figure out some of the emotional responses they're having. So helping them to talk about those. And this is another amazing part of who you are. And this is how we can learn to express and control our emotions. And then you can see how very easily that will also relate to physical development. We want to be able to express, we want to be able to control, we want to be able to be appropriate. And sometimes parents may shy away from the physical side, but if we think about the kind of emotional, spiritual, sexual, physical development, all as important things we can talk with our children about and help them to see over time how those are related, it also becomes more natural for us to talk about all of them.
And I I'm laughing a little bit over here because I have a 2-year-old who's very much going through that, like screaming about everything.
It
So
looks
that's
like,
helpful.
yeah, it looks like you're angry. Okay.
Yeah. Like, okay, how can we do this a different way? Like, yes, it can be so tricky, but I love that even though many parents might be more comfortable to talk about the mind or emotions, to remember that the body is so important to include in that. Are there any suggestions you would give to parents for this age and how to overlap kind of the mind and body in conversations, learning to control? Or
Well, I mean, I think at this age, you're also setting the stage for positive body image and just positive self-esteem. I mean, most young children have very healthy self-esteem, but just watching the way that you're talking about your own emotions and your child's emotions and their body and I mean, let's say your child is throwing a temper tantrum. If you're really negative about their emotions and really negative about how they're expressing them, then over time, that's going to be harder for them to understand that emotion is a good thing. And we just need to keep it within limits and bounds. And the same thing goes for their physical development. I think the goal, again, is to overall help the child to recognize how amazing their body is, which includes their emotions and their mind and their brain. And I mean, you can explain how their brain works to them from a pretty young age. Those sorts of things will help them to be so fascinated with the miracle that is their body.
so now, as we're kind of getting to the older ages of talking with our children about sexuality, how do the sex talks start to change from birth to 3, where we're mainly just talking about our bodies and how amazing they are and body parts, to now they're between the ages of 3 and 7?
So the first thing that's probably worth saying is that it really varies by where your child's at. So I can say something's developmentally appropriate, and sometimes people don't know what that means. I can say ages 3 to 7, but it really depends on where your child is at. What I typically say is if they're old enough to ask you a question, they're old enough for the answer. Obviously, you're going to give a different answer to a 15-year-old than to a 6-year-old, but you want to keep it simple at this age and make sure you understand what they're asking about. So sometimes they may ask a question and you think it's a sexual question. It's actually not. And so then you go on this long explanation and then they're just confused.
I have done that.
Yeah. So you think you're being this great, I'm being this great parent and I'm talking about sexuality and they're like, what? Make sure you understand what they're asking, but also don't wait for them to ask. They are going to be exploring their bodies more and you can bring that up more. And they're going to be asking how babies are made. And you can say they're dropped off by a stork, but that's not an appropriate explanation. So you can tell them in a basic way. Like I might say to my 4-year-old, it's like a puzzle piece, mommy and daddy fit together. And that's, and I might get a little bit more, when my son was, I think 5, he started asking questions. And so we talked about sperm and eggs and how things worked. And it was a little embarrassing when he talked to his young friends about sperms and eggs and they didn't know what he was talking about, but he knew how his body worked and he was fascinated to understand that. And he was old enough to understand it. Now he's 9. And so we might have more conversations about actually how sexuality works and what that looks like in marriage. But that's my child. And then each parent needs to figure out what their child is ready to hear and not wait for them to ask, but start at this age to talk about it a little bit more, talk about bodies, talk about marriage. You're expressing affection with your spouse and other things like that. They might have questions, but you might also just get comfortable talking about it.
I love that you talked about developmentally appropriate, because I feel like that term is thrown around so much. And as a parent, it's like, I don't know what that means. So just like you said, I just wanted to reiterate that. So if they're ready to ask about it, you would say that would kind of show that they're ready to have the answer. I really liked that a lot. And with this age group, when they're asking questions about how babies are made, where they come from, would you go into detail about a penis going into a vagina at this age, depending on where you think they're appropriate? Or would you more just talk about like a daddy has sperm and that travels to get to the egg? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, we certainly don't know from research. I can't tell you from research what is, more effective or not effective.
Yeah.
I would simply go with where, what types of conversations you've already had and what the child is ready for. So I probably had that conversation of, where the penis goes and what the vagina, how it works a little earlier than most parents. I was doing better with my final child. I had 2 older children that I didn't do as well with. And so we had talked about a lot by this time. And so we'd already talked about sperm and eggs and how it worked biologically. And probably when he was 7, I might have had, a more detailed conversation. Again, not a conversation like I'd have with a 15-year-old, but I might have given more detail. And you don't want to start with that maybe. But if your child's been really inquisitive or you've been really open about sexuality, then I think from an earlier age, You can help them to understand this is a sacred topic and this is really important. It doesn't have to be a secret topic though.
Yeah.
It's something that we can, and if you ever have questions. So it also depends on birth order. So my youngest son, who's 9, has 2 older siblings. So he hears all sorts of things and has all sorts of questions and is more precocious than a 7-year-old who might be the oldest. And so you have to think, he's hearing things and coming across things. So then he has questions. And from a very early age, our children need to know that if they have questions, we are the source for the answers. Because if they go to the internet or if they go to friends, they're going to find answers that we don't necessarily want. So from that very early age, letting them know, if you have any kind of question, it doesn't matter what you say to me, I am not going to overreact. Now, if you do, just say, sorry, I just overreacted. Let's talk about this. We want them to come to us. And then the other topic I would start to introduce from an early age, but definitely at the 3 to 7, is sexual safety. So helping children to understand that, nobody should be touching your body except, mommy and daddy when we're giving a bath, and you don't want to ask consistently, has somebody touched you today? Sometimes parents get a little oversensitive about that. And then it creates a lot of paranoia for the children. And, but just occasionally you just want to check in and make sure, what would you do if somebody touched you inappropriately? But you never want to have those conversations right along with a healthy sexuality conversation, because the safety conversations are meant to help the child understand that their body is theirs and it needs to be safe. And sometimes if you have those conversations with a healthy sexuality conversation, it's hard for them to distinguish sex is wonderful and positive and these feelings are good and natural. And then there's this sexual safety part that can get confusing for them. So have those conversations at different times, but that's also a message we want to communicate. I mean, you meet more and more young kids now. I meet them and I'll see it, one kid hug another and I'll hear the young little girl say, this is my body and nobody touches it without permission. And I think, yes. Those parents are teaching them, about boundaries, and that's really important.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I heard my 6-year-old and 4-year-old were having a conversation several months ago. I may have shared this on a previous episode, but it was so funny. And my son was saying well, when I get married, I want to have 23 kids or whatever. And my daughter was like, well, you'll have to talk to whoever you marry. And I was like, yes.
There might be another opinion.
It's so good. I found myself sometimes in the bathtub is, my place where a lot of these things come up, where we're talking about body parts. As I'm talking about body parts, talk about, well, and remember, only me and daddy get to touch you or whatever. And so that's been kind of tricky. How would you separate those more? Maybe I've kind of brought in the safety a little bit too much when it's just a casual conversation about our bodies.
And again, in all of these conversations, I wouldn't stress too much about whether you're doing it right or how you're doing it or when you're doing it. Honestly, just have the conversations and do your best. I mean, I think we can get a little too worried about exactly how it's done. You've hit an important point, is that with younger kids, usually your conversation, I'm using air quotes here, it's very brief. It's like you might be saying one little thing here and there. This is not a long lecture where you sit your 4-year-old down for 20 minutes and talk about their body. That is, one, not effective, and it's just not realistic either, right? So these might be just very little comments. So maybe when you're talking about that in the bathtub, then you're not following it with, but remember, sexual feelings are wonderful and good. And I mean, those just wouldn't really fit together in a conversation at this age anyway. But, a lot of times, at least when my kids were younger, we would shower together, or, they're going to have one of the most common questions kids ask at this age, especially boys, is they're wondering why mom doesn't have a penis. They're wondering why they look different. Kids are really interested in why they look different from other people, why their sister doesn't look like they do. So that gives you the opportunity to talk a little bit about it in a positive way. And then sometime in a different conversation, you can talk about sexual safety.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up too, about showering with your kids, because I found that to be really helpful. My husband and I are pretty open. We're not don't come in, we're showering. And that's just been a great instigator for oh, Papa has a penis and you don't, and it's yep, you're right. And so that's been a great way. What would you kind of tell parents whose children aren't asking questions? And this topic can be really hard for a lot of people to bring up. What are some tips you might give them to start bringing these things up if it's not happening in a natural way?
At this age, and again, I think this is totally normal because, this generation of parents, we're really trying to do a better job with this, but we didn't always have the best example, and no fault, necessarily to our parents. It's just their examples were not great either. Just do the best that you can. One thing that really helps is look for a book that you could read to them and start the conversation. So trying to be proactive. If you feel a little nervous about just talking about it, There's a number of good books out there, and I don't have a particular recommendation now, but if you just go to the library or get on Amazon, just try some. There are some that are a little too detailed, and I think, no, I'm not ready for that one. And there's others where I think this is perfect. So find whatever balance works for you, where your child will start to realize, hey, when I have questions about my body, I can ask my mom or dad. They're not going to be afraid to talk about it. Kids are going to not even realize that it's something that we're uncomfortable talking about if we start talking about it from a young age. So if you're nervous about it, try to find a book. They have comics, they have all kinds of different versions of helping kids think about their bodies and talk about their bodies and where babies come from. That can help if you're nervous.
Thank you so much. As we're closing up this section of the 3-part series, is there anything else you'd want to share with parents for kids that are these ages, birth to 7?
The principles are to really be open about talking about these and to be proactive. So really start early. And sometimes parents are nervous about talking about this. So I'm just going to wait until they need the conversation. We need to talk to our kids earlier because of the world that they live in right now and how sexualized it is. We need to be able to have these conversations. And then we need to, from an early age, start to be thinking about what kind of sexuality values we're trying to teach our children and why it's important to us, how that fits with their emotional and spiritual and other aspects, social aspects of their development.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
I hope that this episode gave you some great things to think about and talk about with your partner about how you want to talk with your kids about sex starting from birth to age 7. And I know for me at this age with my children, it's been so helpful to just practice saying the words of their genitals and to just start these conversations. Like Dr. Padilla-Walker said, I'm so grateful she talked about it. It doesn't really matter as much maybe how these conversations go, but that we're having them and we're trying and we're going to get better as we practice. Even if you haven't started talking with your kids about their correct anatomical terms, it's not too late. It's never too late to start. And you can start having those conversations now and learning together and overcoming some of the shame or discomfort that you may feel around this topic with your kids. And that's going to be such a benefit for you and for them. Kristen Hodson, a sex educator that is fantastic, she talks about that naming genitals should be like listing off a grocery list. Like we would say to someone, oh, we're going to go to the store and get milk and eggs, we should be able to list off penis, vagina, vulva, testicles, clitoris. All of these things should just be able to come off without feeling awkward and just be kind of like you may list off a grocery list. And I think that's a great place to start. You can even start practicing that in front of the mirror if you feel uncomfortable. Using those words with somebody else, with your partner or with your kids. Just try it by yourself and keep practicing and you are going to get better and it's going to be easier. So make sure and tune in to the next 2 episodes where we'll cover ages 9 to 12 and teens. As always, thanks for talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Brett Hansey, our newsletter guru, Lauren Barton, and our miscellaneous task whiz, Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.